Hello, this is Cliff Barrows. The following message was recorded at the Billy Graham Training Center at The Cove in Asheville, North Carolina. The ministry of The Cove grew out of a desire of Dr. and Mrs. Graham to train people in God's Word to win others to Christ. May the Lord richly bless the use of this tape in your life to further that purpose.
Thank you, Kendra. Just beautiful. Such a privilege to be here this weekend. I thank you all. You're lovely ladies. You've been a wonderful audience, attentive, forgiving, loving. And Ann has asked me to share a little bit. I'd rather talk about church history than talk about myself any day, but I'm not going to talk about myself. I'm going to talk about the Lord and what He did with little or nothing. And I still feel that I haven't changed much from that, but at any rate, that God has done a lot of changing. And I could call this my conversion, my call, my commitment, my commission. I think I'd rather call it the Word made flesh, the wonder of it all, and the will to do His will. Because it's been a story of constantly bringing my will into line with God's will. And yet I was not a strong-willed child. I was what Dr. Dobson would call a compliant child. Just wanted to please. And I was born in Oakland, California, in a Catholic hospital. My mother was Christian Missionary Alliance. Does anybody know what that is? A very small denomination. Oh, you're all sitting together back there. Very small denomination. She was from New York. My father was from Massachusetts, and he was a Methodist. And yet I did not grow up in a home that said anything about the Bible or Christ. Never went to church until I was 14 years old. That's another story. My earliest memory is of my father leaving the home when I was 2 years old, and he never came back. And I had two older brothers, and they were just like Kendra's. I could tell you many, many stories. They didn't seem to know what to do with the little sister except to tease and torment. And my mother, who worked to support the three of us on $118 a month as a public health nurse, was working most of the time, and I was left with my brothers, and we had a kitchen with a bench that the lid lifted up, and they were supposed to be babysitting me, but they would put me inside that, close the lid, and say, now, don't come out until we tell you. Well, they'd be gone for hours, but I didn't come out. And so to this day, I have claustrophobia a little bit. The Lord's given me victory over that. They didn't mean to be mean in any of the things that they did. I'm sure they don't even remember it today when I once in a while remind them what wonderful brothers. My nickname was the Brat. And, Mom, Mother, the brat is doing this or that. So it's not great for your self-esteem. But it was interesting, to say the least. They left the home when I was very young. They were older than I was by several years. And so they weren't there very long. And then it was just my mother and me for many years. We didn't have any company. I can never remember having anyone over to our home. She was just too exhausted and too busy with her working and keeping the home together. She did a wonderful job. She was a good mother. But she was, I guess, bitter over her divorce, whatever it was. Her early growing up at the Nyack Institute of Christian Missionary Alliance did not impact our lives in any way. And when finally, at the age of 14, someone invited me to church, I was in high school, and we shared the piano bench in the orchestra, and she had just been converted in a church, and so she invited me, and I was scared to death. I didn't know what people did in church or what church was, and I gave many, many excuses for several weeks, finally ran out of excuses, and I agreed to go with her. That morning there was an evangelist who later lost his faith and went to Hollywood and was never heard of again. But he preached a wonderful sermon that morning on Matthew 14. I can remember it to this day. Peter sinking beneath the waves. Now, I'm chicken of the sea. I do not swim, and the idea of anyone sinking beneath the waves was absolutely terrifying. So he got my attention. And then he said at the end that Peter stretched out his hand to the Lord, and would anyone here like to stretch out their hand to the Lord? Well, I just, without even thinking, wanted to do that. Goodness, if you're sinking beneath the waves, that's about the only thing you can do. And then he did what I thought was a terrible thing. He said, well, now would you who've raised your hands, guess what? Come forward. And I remember when Ann came for orientation, she was very shy. Well, I can outshy Ann. About the only thing I can outdo of Ann. But I didn't know what to do. But he had said if you raised your hand to come forward, so I found myself walking down that aisle, and for some reason weeping. And in the little booth where they take you with some deaconess or other, she explained what had happened to me and told me I needed to be baptized, and that's under the water. And the Lord saved me in a Baptist church. But that was his business, so we set up an appointment when I would be baptized. I went home and told my mother what had happened to me, and she said, "What did you do that for?" So there wasn't a whole lot of encouragement, but she went on to become White Cross chairman and to renew her commitment to the Lord. And I later found out that my father also knew the Lord. I only saw him twice while I was growing up. She took me to see him 2 times, once when I was 6 and once when I was 9. Then when I became grown, I could go and see him myself and get to know him a little more, and found out that he was a dear Christian man. He never remarried. My mother did remarry when I was 12, and I was the witness to that ceremony. I have not told any audience that there was abuse in my childhood, and I don't make it a big thing. It didn't seem to impact my life at all. It wasn't my brother's. It was an outside person. But and I know now that you're supposed to seek counseling and all of that thing, and I'm sure it's had its impact. But as soon as I knew the Lord, I majored in psychology in college and decided I hated that and dropped out of a psychology major. It seemed to be going nowhere. But I did say to the Lord Jesus Christ, "You are going to be my psychologist and my psychiatrist, and I'm never going to seek another one." Now that has nothing to do with what any choice anyone else may make. That was my choice. And he has been faithful. I believe he has been faithful. While I worked my way through the University of California, one thing my mother did was to let us all know that we were supposed to go through the university. There was no money to do that, but we just had that drive and that goal, and we all made it. And I would work 1 year and go to school 1 year, and work 1 year and go to school 1 year. And that was a good experience. The Lord led in all of that. Meanwhile, I was at church. The year after I was saved, when I was 15, someone paid my way to go to Mount Hermon, and I never knew who that was. But there at Mount Hermon, California, Dr. Barnhouse was the speaker, and Charles Fuller, the two of them. So I was a brand new Christian, knowing nothing, never having opened a Bible until my conversion. I met 2 heavyweights, and I just sat there open mouth. I soaked up every word, wrote as fast as I could, and I can remember their messages to this day. And every summer thereafter, I went to Mount Hermon and heard wonderful speakers, Charles DeHaan, M.R. DeHaan, and many that have passed off the scene now. They've laid aside their burdens, but they were solid doctrine, and I learned a great deal from them and just soaked it up. We had good speakers come to our church in Oakland, and so I appreciated doctrine from the very first moment that I was a Christian, and had really good, outstanding training, wonderful music in our church. The came to be the husband of the girl that invited me to church. He could break a glass. He was a wonderful tenor, now a pastor in Colorado Springs. But the day after I was converted, he called me up and he said, "You have to start memorizing scripture. I want you to memorize 1 Corinthians 10:13, and I'll hear you repeat it next week." And so I looked that up in my Bible, memorized it, scared to death not to repeat it to him. And every week he would give me another verse. He was a navigator, and I found out about the navigators through Leonard Wex. And years later, I'm going to leap all over the place. You can follow me if you want to, but you don't have to. You just heard me do that yesterday anyhow. Years later, my daughter sang at an anniversary of my church in Oakland where I had been saved. And the lady playing the piano said to her, and this was Mrs. Leonard Wex, the woman that had first invited me to church, said to my daughter, "I was your mother's best friend." And my daughter looked at her, and she'd never heard about her or knew who she was. So we don't always tell our children even who we really are. That was kind of interesting to me when she said, "Mother, who is Shirley Wex?" So we need to clue our children in. Well, somewhere in the middle of going to the University of California and working and studying my lessons on the bus, a young man came to our church, a tall, blonde Scotsman. I was also working at a bank downtown, and I noticed that he would come in every payday and stand in my line, so I knew exactly how much he made. I cashed his check. And he worked nights. He was going to law school and working nights, and he always looked a little scruffy by the time he came in the morning. He'd ask me out for coffee, but I wouldn't go. I was afraid. I really didn't know much about men. My brothers had gone, my father had left, and I had grown up with only my mother, so men were a foreign territory. And so I never accepted his invitation. But then when Wednesday night I was playing the piano for prayer meeting, and I saw him walk in with his mother, and I thought, that's the man that stands in my line. Any man who'll come to prayer meeting with his mother has to be okay. So the next time he asked me out for coffee, I went. And then he showed up at a Halloween party, and he did a lot of magic tricks and was the life of the party. And all the girls thought he was wonderful. He was tall and blonde. And he said if anyone would eat orange ice cream and pickled herring, he would take them home. And I thought, I can do that. So ran out to the delicatessen down the street, got some orange ice cream and some pickled herring, and came back and just sat there and ate it, and he took me home. So then we went to a movie, some old Joan Crawford thing that was, the title of it was This Woman Is Mine. And afterwards we parked up in the hills overlooking the Oakland scene. And as usual, I was scared to death. And he said, what'd you think of the movie? And I said, well, it was a good movie. And he said, would you like to be mine? And I, compliant child. And I thought, well, you're a Christian. I thought that was all it took. And he was nice looking and had a good job, and I knew how much he made. So I said, well, let's give it some real thought. And we thought for a little bit, and I guess about 9 months later we were married. He was still going to law school and working, and I was going to Cal and working, and we just kind of passed like this. We had a little tiny place to live, a little tiny house where you had to put up the card table in the living room to have meals and then put it down so you could get through the living room to the bedroom, walk over the bed to the dresser, one of those beds that you pull down out of the wall. So life has always been exciting and interesting. I haven't been bored a moment, and I believe that the 11th commandment is that thou shalt not bore. And so but God has been wonderful. Well, I did graduate 2 children later. I graduated from the University of California. It took 10 years to go through 4 years of college. And at that time, I took a lot of courses and kept changing majors and never could really settle down to one particular major. But the Lord used that all later. And I finally just took whatever they'd offer me to get out of there. And I said, you put together a major and I'll sign the paper. So I did graduate, and had the one. Lael was 4 and Leslie was 1, and my husband, who didn't care for winter sports, although he's really loves all sports. I still don't understand why he doesn't like winter sports, but he knew that I did. So he said, I'll watch the baby, and you take Lael and you go skiing with a friend. So I did, and that was not very smart because that day I went down the hill one too many times and hit a sitz mark, and it flipped me, and I had borrowed equipment on. The shoes didn't really match the skis and so forth. So I heard my leg snap in midair, and when I came down, it was lying at a quarter at an angle to my leg, and I guess I went into shock. But the upshot of that was that it was a real spiritual crisis. When I finally got back to Oakland and had one of the leading orthopedic men take me as his case, it had been set up in the mountains, and so he didn't reset it. He let it go for 6 weeks. And what they didn't know was that I had contracted staphylococcus there, and also osteomyelitis, and gangrene was setting in. So that by the time he opened it in one of the leading hospitals in Oakland, he opened it 6 weeks later, he cursed and swore, and he said, how did this ever happen? And it was horrible. And so he really went to work and finally prepared me for another operation and said, I don't think we're going to be able to save it. And so that night, I surrendered everything to the Lord. And I just said, Lord, whatever's left is all yours. I had been holding on to the banana, and there had been things that I knew God wanted me to give up. And I wanted to raise my children. One thing I'd always wanted in life was children. And that was one reason I got married, was I knew you had to get married to have children. And I had the 2 girls then, so I said, Lord, if you will heal me, I will give, well, even if you don't, I will give you everything. It doesn't matter at this point. And that was total surrender. So the next day, he didn't have to take my leg off. He said it would always be shorter and it would always bother me, and none of that happened. It was complete healing. Only the scars left so that I can remember what God did. But it's never given me a day's trouble from that day to this. I felt the Lord healed it. Well, while I was still in the wheelchair and on canes and crutches and the whole thing, and trying to have crutches under your arm and hold a baby and go upstairs, it's quite an experience. But it was fun, and the Lord took us through it. But it was at that time that Billy Graham scheduled his crusade by the Golden Gate in south of San Francisco. And I wanted so much to be a counselor at that, and signed up to be a counselor. And the Lord just didn't allow me to be, and I was very, very disappointed that because of being on crutches, I couldn't go to the Cow Palace and be part of that crusade. But our church knew that after that crusade, we would be flooded with people wanting Bible studies. And one lady in our church, Kay Goodnison, had heard Miss Johnson at Mount Hermon, and Miss Johnson was at that point in San Bernardino teaching 2 classes. That's all there were the 2 classes called Miss Johnson's Bible class. She hated that, but she didn't know what else to call them. So this lady said to our pastor, why don't you call this woman in San Bernardino to come up and handle all these people in a Bible class just until they get grounded? And he thought that was a good idea. So he called her, and she came up expecting to go back to San Bernardino, which she never did. She stayed there in Oakland. She started the Bible class. A neighbor across the street from me said, I think you ought to go hear this woman. I'll clean your house, I'll take care of your children, I'll do your laundry. She never did any of those things, but it was it sounded good. And I bought into it, and I went to the Bible class. And I was just astounded. I had heard many good Bible teachers, but I had never heard the Bible taught as relevant as it was, with application, and it just got right inside. I went home knowing exactly what I was supposed to do. The aim was so clear. I did it, and when I came back the next week and felt so good that I had done what she said something else to do. So I had to go home that week and do that. And so I had to keep coming back every week to find out what the aim is and what I was supposed to do. And one morning, someone told her I played the piano, and she asked me if I would play the piano, so I did, and she seemed to like it. So from then on, I played the piano for her, and she'd come and put her hand on my shoulder, and I knew just what tempo she wanted. And the tempo kept getting faster and faster and faster. And she believed in that 11th commandment, too, that thou shalt not bore. And it was never, ever boring. I became a discussion leader, and then she wanted to leave our class. Dr. Munger in Berkeley was having someone call her every week to come and start a class in Berkeley. And she said to me one day that she was going to go to Berkeley and start that class, and would I teach the Oakland class? And I thought, oh, those poor ladies. They've had Miss Johnson, and now they're going to have me. And I thought, Lord, you're not going to ask me to do that, are you? A compliant child. I couldn't say no to Miss Johnson. I never could. And anything she asked me to do, I would do it. And I never thought I could do it, but if she thought I could do it, I would die in the attempt. So I followed her around. That became the story of my life. Jack is very supportive. He must have been a compliant child, too. Usually they don't marry each other, but extremely supportive. And she would call. We were having leaders meeting Monday morning. She would teach Tuesday morning. I would teach Wednesday morning. She would write all day Wednesday, and then Thursday she would call me and give me her handwritten notes, Scotch tape, stapled, written all over with an English script, and I would take them home and just awestruck, I would type them and soak up what they said at the same time. Take them back to her, she rewrite them. Friday I'd type them all over again, and Sunday in church she would hand them to someone to be run off at church, and we'd hand them out Monday morning. And that schedule kept up for 5 years. I typed the whole 5-year series. You name any hour of the day and night, and I typed at that hour. And somehow the children grew, and Jack kept working, and we kept saying hi and bye. And he was so good. He was a wonderful father. And the girls say that I was a good mother. I really can't remember much about it, but I loved them, and I always wanted to be with them. I was always torn when I had to go away. But Miss Johnson began to invite me to go on retreats with her. And then she invited me onto staff when the Lord gave them property and office buildings and so forth. And it was just all so wonderful. It was so incredible. It was so exciting that it was almost hard to sleep any night, except that you absolutely had to. And the orientations came, and we just looked to see who these people were that God was putting his hand on and putting his blessing on. And they were going to teach a class in Little Rock or in Wenatchee, Washington, or in Madison, Wisconsin. And I watched them all come and never forgot a name. I knew all the teaching leaders, even when we got up to 500 classes. I knew them all, and they were just, I thought they were angels. And then Miss Johnson one day said, something was very hush-hush. We were not to breathe a word to anyone, but there would be, in that orientation, someone extremely special, and this word was not to get out. And the minute Ann walked in the door, we all knew who she was. You look just like your father. And Helen was right with her. And we were just all agog that we had Billy Graham's daughter and her friend Helen in our training. And then Ms. Johnson got up and told the whole Walnut Creek class of 700 women who she was. But we had to keep it quiet. That was the story of our lives. And Ms. Johnson would tell the world, but she didn't want us to tell the world. She wanted to she wanted to do it. And that was okay. I adored her. And I hung on her every word, and I sat through many, many hours of lectures and seminars and meetings, and those were wonderful, wonderful years. And then, meanwhile, I had another baby, another girl, over an Easter vacation, never missed a class, and Miss Johnson allowed me to sit outside the door with my baby, 2-week-old baby, and listen to the leaders' meeting, and that way I could still teach my class. And so Lynn now tells everybody that she's had more BSF by the time she was 5 than most people have had in their whole lifetime, because she went to the Monday morning, the Tuesday morning, the Wednesday morning, and I was teaching 2 classes then, the Thursday morning, and she'd go 4 days a week, and she grew up in BSF. And 2 weeks ago, she gave her first lecture on Esther in Oklahoma City. All my children have been children in BSF and grown up to be leaders. All 3 girls have been leaders in the young adults and in regular classes. The Lord has been very good to us. Jack also taught for 10 years in BSF. He thought if you can't beat them, you'd better join them. And my time is up. Well, Miss Johnson became very ill and had her mastectomy. I had a hysterectomy, and she came to see me in the hospital, and a month later I went to see her in the hospital when she had her mastectomy. A month later she was off to Switzerland carrying her own luggage. You could not keep that lady down. But the handwriting, I guess, was on the wall. Things began to change. It began to be a little more tense, a little more difficult. There were some struggles going on behind the scenes. I can't tell you all the details, but it began to be heart-wrenching. And events came along that one day it came down to the board meeting. It was a September 10th, and it was between, for some reason that I will never know, it was between another woman and myself as to who would be the next leader of Bible Study Fellowship. And the Lord made his decision, and I was very comfortable with it because I knew that was a big job. It was organizational, and I'm not an organizer. And Rosemary Jensen is an organizer. She's an administrator. And we had been given 90 acres in San Antonio, where she lived, to build a headquarters. And so for all the above reasons, Rosemary was named. And I was honored that I was even in the same ballpark of that decision. So Rosemary then said, would I be her deputy director? I went home to Jack, and we had a little rule that he always made the big decisions and I made the little decisions. He just wondered why there'd never been any big decisions in all those years. So I said, Jack, I have a big decision. Rosemary's asked me to be her deputy director, and that means we'd move to Texas. And he said, let's go. He'd had a bad day at work, and he was he was ready. He was more ready than I was. So in just 2 months, we'd sold our house. We were on the road. 2 daughters were married. Lynn wasn't. She was still she was finishing high school, about to enter college. And she met a wonderful young man in Trinity College in San Antonio, and is convinced that the only reason we moved to Texas was that she could meet Stanton. But he'd grown up in a I can't tell you what church, I just can't, but he grew up in a particular church denomination, and he had never really heard the gospel so that it penetrated. He thought he was a Christian, but Lynn told him, she said, you're not a Christian, I can't date you. This wonderful young man. So he right away went to see the youth leader of the Bible Study Fellowship young adults class, where Lynn was the leader, and he was attending, and the leader had breakfast with him and led him to the Lord that morning. So after that, they were inseparable, and she now lives in Oklahoma City. I faced death a few times, once almost from drowning when I thought I could. Well, I watched everybody else swim out to Catalina. I thought, that looks easy. So I jumped into the water and tried to swim out there to the, not to Catalina, I'm sorry, I was on Catalina, to a raft that was out quite a ways in the water, and everyone was having such a good time. I got out there, but then what I didn't know was that I didn't have enough strength left to pull myself up on the raft, and nobody could hear me. I was down under this thing, and I thought, I can't get up and I can't go back. I don't have any strength to go back. I guess this is it, Lord. I opened the pearly gates, I'm coming home. But right at that time, I felt arms around me saying, just relax. I've been watching you. I'll get you back to the shore. And he did. He pulled me back to the shore, and then he disappeared. So I think that was an angel. There have been times when I, too, have hydroplaned and spun out and gotten out of the car to see the rear wheels hanging over this chasm. But somehow we were okay. And then I had my bout with cancer and with a melanoma on my back, and we paid all my debts and was ready again to say, Lord, I guess I'm coming home. But God again healed perfectly, and as far as I know, there's no trace of cancer today. Then just 5 years ago, another incredible thing happened. I was realizing that my work in Bible Study Fellowship was done. I expected to die in Bible Study Fellowship. I thought you did. But I began to see again the cloud moving, and I realized that something was happening, that I felt finished. So I began to plan my retirement. Didn't tell anybody, but just began to think about how it would work and what we would do, where we would go. We lived in Texas 7 years, and it had been a wonderful time of, again, watching the work double and grow. And then one day the phone rang, and a lady in California said, you don't know me, but my name is so-and-so, and our church I'm on a search committee for a director of women's ministries. Do you know of any former teaching leaders or anyone who might be interested? So I gave her a few names, and she thanked me very much, and she called again a week later. And she said, do you know any more names? And I said, no, I really told you everything that I know, but I'll think about it. And she said, yes, please think about it. So she called a week later and asked me if I was thinking about it. And I thought, thinking about what? And then I did begin to think about it and began to pray about it and told Jack about it. And he said, write your resume. Well, I'd never written a resume. So he said he'd help me write it. And I said, well, we can write it, but I'm not going to mail it. So he mailed it. And I guess he wanted to go back to California. He's a homesick boy. So the upshot was that I did resign from Bible Study Fellowship, did move back to California, and I'm on the staff where I've been commissioned, which is just under being ordained. I've run through the hoops that you do in the denomination. It's a different, small denomination, but I went back to their seminary in Chicago and did their doctrine and history course, and then the head of their denomination patted me on the head, which, in a ceremony, which means that you are commissioned in their church. So that is the story, and I am pro-life. Early in our marriage, we made the decision not to use any birth control, and I have no criticism of anyone who does. That was our decision, to just see how many children God wanted us to have. We had the 3 girls, and we lost 3, 2 of which we know were boys, and we certainly didn't want to or intend to. That's just what God did. And losing the 3 was harder than having the 3. I don't know how any woman just goes blithely through an abortion, because it was difficult physically and spiritually and emotionally, all 3 times. But I heard a message that said from Psalm 139 that those 3 little ones are in heaven. One of them is over in the University of California in San Francisco. It was such a perfect little fetus that the doctor said, may I take this? And as far as I know, it's still there. Maybe it isn't, but it was a perfect little 5-month fetus. And so God has been very faithful and given me many verses and kept me. And then Anne has been a precious friend. It's been thrilling to see her exercise her gifts and grow and develop into her own ministry. That has been one of the highlights of my life. So the Lord bless you and use you. Thank you.